I never thought I'd return to Wren's Hollow, much less to that creaking, decaying mansion where my childhood memories lay buried like bones under the floorboards. Yet here I was, gripping the steering wheel so tightly that my knuckles had turned white, staring up at the house through the cracked windshield of my old Chevy. It stood like a corpse, gray and peeling, its wide porch sagging under the weight of years gone by. Every fiber of my being told me to turn the car around, to leave this godforsaken place behind. But I couldn't, not after the phone call. Ben, the voice on the line, had whispered the night before, quivering and low. "You need to come back. It's Ma. She's not well." I hadn't recognized the voice at first, but it had to be Uncle Roy. He was the only one who would call me, the only one still alive who remembered the nightmare that had unfolded here over 20 years ago. He didn't say much, just enough to remind me of the promise I'd made on the day I'd left. "I'll come back if I have to." And now I had to. The engine sputtered as I killed the ignition, the muffled roar fading into the oppressive silence that blanketed the property. I stepped out of the car, my boots crunching on the gravel, and felt the air press against me thick, damp, and heavy with a smell that made my stomach churn. It was the scent of decay, of rot and mildew, and something metallic that clung to the back of my throat. The porch groaned under my weight as I ascended the steps. I reached for the doorknob, hesitated, then knocked instead. The sound echoed hollowly, unanswered. I frowned and pushed the door open. Inside, the house was as I remembered it, dark, suffocating, the air stagnant with a mix of old wood, damp upholstery, and something else, something sharper. My throat tightened as I stepped into the entryway, the weight of the house bearing down on me. The walls seemed closer than they should have been, the shadows deeper, stretching out in unnatural shapes. "Ma?" I called out, my voice trembling. Nothing. Only silence, broken by the faint creak of wood as the house settled around me. I moved deeper into the house, my footsteps muffled on the threadbare carpet. The living room lay to my left, its once grand furniture draped in sheets like ghosts waiting to wake. To my right, the kitchen beckoned, a faint flicker of light spilling through the doorway. The light wasn't natural, it pulsed faintly, like the glow of embers. My pulse quickened as I approached, the hairs on the back of my neck standing on end. The kitchen was a wrecked, cabinets hung open, dishes lay shattered on the floor, and the table was overturned. But it was the stove that caught my attention. A pot sat on the burner, glowing red hot. Smoke curled from its edges, filling the room with that acrid, metallic stench that made me gag. I reached out to turn off the burner, but then I saw it on the floor. A trail of dark stains smeared across the tiles, leading from the stove to the basement door. My stomach lurched as I stared at the basement door, its chipped paint and rusted hinges suddenly ominous. Memories clawed their way to the surface, memories I'd spent years burying. The basement had always been off limits. We'd been warned, my sister Ellie and I, never to go down there. I hadn't thought much of it back then, chalking it up to one of May's quirks. But now, "Ma," I called out again, my voice cracking. The silence was broken by a faint sound. A whisper, no, a whimper. It came from behind the basement door. My heart thundered in my chest as I stepped closer, my hand trembling as it reached for the doorknob. The door creaked open, revealing a staircase that plunged into darkness. The whimpering grew louder, echoing faintly from below. I hesitated, every instinct screaming at me to turn back, but something, curiosity, fear, obligation, drove me forward. I descended the stairs, the wooden steps groaning under my weight. The air grew colder, damper, the smell of rot thickening with every step. When I reached the bottom, I fumbled for the light switch, but the bulb above flickered weakly, casting more shadows than light. "Ma," I whispered, my voice barely audible over the pounding of my heart. She was there, crouched in the far corner of the basement, her back to me. Her thin frame was wrapped in a tattered shawl, her gray hair tangled and matted, She rocked back and forth, her hands clutching something to her chest. "Ma?" I said again, louder this time. She stopped rocking. Slowly, she turned her head to look at me, and my breath caught in my throat. Her face was pale, her eyes hollow, her lips trembling as she muttered something I couldn't understand. But it wasn't her face that froze me in place, it was what she held. It was Ellie, or what was left of her. The bundle in Ma's arms was small, too small to be a person. But it had Ellie's face, or a twisted, hollow version of it. Her once bright eyes were black and lifeless, her cheeks sunken, her skin waxy and gray. I stumbled back, my legs weak, bile rising in my throat. "She came back," Ben, Massachusetts whispered, her voice trembling. I couldn't leave her. She needed me. What did you do?" I stammered, my hands shaking. "She came back," Ma repeated, her voice rising. "She came back, and I had to help her. I had to bring her back." I shook my head, unable to comprehend what I was seeing. Ellie had died. She'd died 10 years ago in a car accident that had shattered our family. This wasn't her. It couldn't be. "No," I said, backing away. "That's not Ellie. That's not Ellie." "She's not the only one," Ma interrupted, her voice growing stronger, more determined. "They'll all come back soon. They'll all need us." "What are you talking about?" I shouted, my voice echoing off the damp walls. "Who's coming back?" Before she could answer, the shadows in the basement began to shift. At first I thought it was a trick of the flickering light, but then I saw them, figures emerging from the darkness. They were small, twisted, their limbs unnaturally long, their faces blank and featureless. They moved silently, their heads tilting as they looked at me. "Ma," I said, my voice shaking, "we need to leave. Now." But she didn't move. She just stood there, holding that thing, her eyes locked on mine. And then she smiled a smile that sent a chill down my spine. "It's too late, Ben," she said softly. "They're already here." The figures moved closer, their twisted bodies casting long, jagged shadows on the walls. I stumbled back, my hand groping for the staircase. And then I ran. I didn't look back as I scrambled up the stairs, my heart pounding in my chest. The last thing I heard before slamming the door shut was Ma's laughter, low and chilling, echoing through the darkness. I ran out of the house, into the night, and didn't stop until I reached the car. As I drove away, the mansion faded into the distance, its dark windows staring after me like empty eyes. But I know this isn't over. They're still there in that house, waiting. And Ma, she's waiting too. When I was young, I used to believe the earth was hollow. My grandfather would tell me stories about great beasts that lived beneath the soil, creatures with tusks like scythes and fur that shimmered in the dim light of underground worlds. He said they were older than memory, waiting for the day they could rise again. As a child, I soaked up his tales, imagining myself exploring those dark, hidden realms. But as I grew older, I dismissed them as the fanciful musings of an aging man. That is, until I found myself descending into the depths of the rainforest in a part of the world that maps barely acknowledge. I'd spent the last decade as a researcher, documenting elusive wildlife in places humanity rarely touched. My work took me to the fringes of civilization, deep jungles, crumbling mountains, forgotten islands. When I received the invitation to join an expedition into the dense heart of the Amazon basin, I couldn't say no. It was a chance to chart a cavern system that had been discovered only months prior, hidden beneath layers of vines and foliage. The locals, however, warned us not to go. They called it La Boca del Mundo, the mouth of the world, and said it was cursed. The few who ventured in either never came back or emerged mad. I dismissed their fears as superstition. So did the rest of the team, 5 of us in total. There was Amara, a geologist with an insatiable curiosity, Marcus, a veteran caver who claimed to have explored caverns on every continent, Dr. Ben Calloway, an anthropologist obsessed with myths of subterranean civilizations, and Ellie, our medic, who seemed far too cheerful for someone willingly heading into a place no sane person would dare approach. I was the biologist brought in to document any unusual flora or fauna we might encounter. We were a ragtag crew united by a shared thirst for the unknown. The entrance to the cave was unlike anything I'd seen before. It wasn't just a hole in the ground, it was a gaping maw, framed by jagged rock that resembled broken teeth. The air around it was unnervingly cold, a stark contrast to the sweltering heat of the rainforest. As we descended, the light from above quickly faded, replaced by the glow of our headlamps. The walls of the cave were slick with moisture, and the sound of dripping water echoed endlessly. The first few days were uneventful. We mapped the caverns, took samples, and marveled at the strange bioluminescent fungi clinging to the walls. Amara theorized that the fungi were part of a larger, interconnected ecosystem that extended deep into the earth. I was fascinated, but something about the air felt wrong, heavy, almost oppressive. It was as though the deeper we went, the more the cave itself seemed alive, watching us. On the fourth day, we found the pit.it was massive, a vertical shaft that plunged into darkness so absolute our lights couldn't penetrate it. The walls were lined with strange carving symbols none of us could identify. Dr. Calloway was ecstatic, rambling about how these markings could be evidence of an ancient subterranean culture. Marcus, ever the pragmatist, suggested we set up camp before deciding whether to proceed. That night, as we huddled around our lanterns, I thought I heard something, a faint, rhythmic thrum, like the distant beating of a drum. When I mentioned it, Amara dismissed it as air currents, but I saw the unease in her eyes. The next morning, Marcus rigged the ropes, and one by one we descended into the pit. It took hours to reach the bottom. When my feet finally touched solid ground, I felt a strange vibration beneath my boots, as if the earth itself were alive. The cavern at the bottom was enormous, its ceiling lost in shadow. Strange, twisted plants grew here, pale and translucent, their leaves quivering as though sensing our presence. The air was colder still, carrying an acrid smell that burned my throat. Then we saw them. At first they looked like shadows moving at the edge of our lights. But as we drew closer, their shapes became clearer, massive creatures, easily twice the size of an elephant, covered in shaggy fur that glistened like wet silk. They had curved tusks and elongated snouts, their movements slow and deliberate. They were woolly mammoths, or something impossibly close to them. Dr. Calloway dropped to his knees, muttering incoherently about living fossils. Amara was frozen, her mouth agape. I couldn't breathe. We didn't have long to marvel. The rhythmic thrum I'd heard earlier returned, louder now, and with it came a low, guttural growl that reverberated through the cavern. The mammoths stiffened, their small, beady eyes darting toward the darkness. Then they bolted, moving with surprising speed toward a cluster of tunnels on the far side of the cavern. We should have followed them. Instead, we stayed, paralyzed by curiosity or stupidity. The growl came again, closer this time. Then we saw the source. Two creatures emerged from the shadows, their forms defying logic. They were canine in shape but grotesquely distorted, their bodies elongated and hunched, their fur patchy and matted. Their eyes glowed faintly in the dark, and their teeth were jagged and oversized. They moved with a predatory grace, circling us as if sizing us up. Don't run, Marcus whispered. Predators chase. But Ellie panicked. She bolted for the nearest tunnel, her scream echoing through the cavern. One of the creatures lunged after her, its speed terrifying. The other turned its gaze to us. Marcus raised his flare gun, firing a shot that lit the cavern in a fiery glow. The creature recoiled but didn't retreat. We need to move, Marcus shouted, grabbing my arm. Amara and Dr. Calloway followed as we sprinted toward the opposite tunnel. The creature pursued, its snarls growing louder. We ran blindly, the tunnel narrowing around us. At some point I lost track of the others. The sound of my own ragged breathing drowned out everything else. When I finally stopped, I was alone. The tunnel opened into a smaller chamber, lit by the faint glow of fungi. My headlamp flickered, its battery nearly dead. I could still hear the growls, though they seemed farther away now. I collapsed against the wall, my chest heaving. That's when I noticed the carvings. It was massive, a vertical shaft that plunged into darkness so absolute our lights couldn't penetrate it. The walls were lined with strange carvings, symbols none of us could identify. Dr. Calloway was ecstatic, rambling about how these markings could be evidence of an ancient subterranean culture. Marcus, ever the pragmatist, suggested we set up camp before deciding whether to proceed. That night, as we huddled around our lanterns, I thought I heard something, a faint, rhythmic thrum, like the distant beating of a drum. When I mentioned it, Amara dismissed it as air currents, but I saw the unease in her eyes. The next morning, Marcus rigged the ropes, and one by one we descended into the pit. It took hours to reach the bottom. When my feet finally touched solid ground, I felt a strange vibration beneath my boots, as if the earth itself were alive. The cavern at the bottom was enormous, its ceiling lost in shadow. Strange, twisted plants grew here, pale and translucent, their leaves quivering as though sensing our presence. The air was colder still, carrying an acrid smell that burned my throat. Then we saw them. At first they looked like shadows moving at the edge of our lights, but as we drew closer, their shapes became clearer, massive creatures, easily twice the size of an elephant, covered in shaggy fur that glistened like wet silk. They had curved tusks and elongated snouts, their movements slow and deliberate. They were woolly mammoths, or something impossibly close to them. Dr. Calloway dropped to his knees, muttering incoherently about living fossils. Amara was frozen, her mouth agape. I couldn't breathe. We didn't have long to marvel. The rhythmic thrum I'd heard earlier returned, louder now, and with it came a low, guttural growl that reverberated through the cavern. The mammoths stiffened, their small, beady eyes darting toward the darkness. Then they bolted, moving with surprising speed toward a cluster of tunnels on the far side of the cavern. We should have followed them. Instead, we stayed, paralyzed by curiosity or stupidity. The growl came again, closer this time. Then we saw the source. Two creatures emerged from the shadows, their forms defying logic. They were canine in shape but grotesquely distorted, their bodies elongated and hunched, their fur patchy and matted. Their eyes glowed faintly in the dark, and their teeth were jagged and oversized. They moved with a predatory grace, circling us as if sizing us up. Don't run, Marcus whispered. Predators chase. But Ellie panicked. She bolted for the nearest tunnel, her scream echoing through the cavern. One of the creatures lunged after her, its speed terrifying. The other turned its gaze to us. Marcus raised his flare gun, firing a shot that lit the cavern in a fiery glow. The creature recoiled but didn't retreat. We need to move, Marcus shouted, grabbing my arm. Amara and Dr. Calloway followed as we sprinted toward the opposite tunnel. The creature pursued, its snarls growing louder. We ran blindly, the tunnel narrowing around us. At some point I lost track of the others. The sound of my own ragged breathing drowned out everything else. When I finally stopped, I was alone. The tunnel opened into a smaller chamber, lit by the faint glow of fungi. My headlamp flickered, its battery nearly dead. I could still hear the growls, though they seemed farther away now. I collapsed against the wall, my chest heaving. That's when I noticed the carvings. They covered the chamber walls, more intricate than the ones near the pit. They depicted strange, humanoid figures with elongated limbs and wide, hollow eyes. They were surrounded by beasts, the mammoths, the distorted canines, and others I couldn't identify. At the center of it all was a massive figure, larger than the others, its face obscured by spiraling lines. A sound behind me made me whirl around. It was Marcus, bloodied and gasping. "We can't stay," he choked out. "They're hurting us. Hurting us where I demanded." But he just shook his head, eyes wild with fear. Before I could press him further, The growls returned, louder and closer. Marcus grabbed my arm, pulling me toward another tunnel. We ran until my legs burned and my lungs felt like they'd burst. Finally, we emerged into a cavern bathed in an eerie, green light. At its center was a massive chasm, its depth swirling with a strange, luminescent mist. "This is it," Marcus said, his voice hollow. The mouth of the world dot before I could respond, the creatures were upon us. Marcus shoved me toward the chasm. "Jump," he screamed. "It's the only way." I hesitated, but the creatures were closing in. With no other choice, I leapt out. The last thing I remember is the sensation of falling, the mist swallowing me whole. When I woke, I was back at the cave's entrance, the rainforest sunlight streaming down. The others were gone. No sign of Marcus, Amara, Ellie, or Dr. Calloway. Only my equipment remained, untouched. To this day, I don't know what I saw or how I survived. But I've never gone back to the wilderness. Some mysteries I've learned are better left buried. For almost a year, I've been a passenger. Not just in the literal sense riding in the back seat of the same private car almost every day, but in my own life. It wasn't always this way. Once I drove myself, both on the road and in my decisions. But then everything changed, and now I find comfort in this strange routine. The first time I booked the ride, it wasn't planned. My own car sat useless in the driveway, and I needed to get to the outskirts of the old city far enough that no one else would take me. Private drivers were reluctant when they saw the route, so when I saw the car pull up and the driver wave me in, I was relieved. I climbed into the back seat, grateful not to have to explain why I was going. He didn't ask. He only smiled and started the engine. The route was long, winding past fields and forgotten towns. The driver, his name was Ayaz, was talkative at first. He introduced himself, made small jokes about the distance, asked why I was going. I didn't respond. I wasn't ready to explain. Instead, I sat silently, watching the road pass by in the reflection of the window, my fingers tracing patterns on the glass. When we arrived, I stepped out without a word. Ayaz lingered for a moment, waiting to see if I needed anything, but I only nodded in thanks and walked toward the edge of the town. It was as I remembered it, quiet, almost deserted. The cobblestones were uneven, cracked from years of neglect. A few shops were open, their windows dusty, the wares inside faded from sunlight. But none of that mattered. I was there for one place, the garden. Tucked behind an old stone wall was the garden. It wasn't much, just a few rows of wildflowers, a crumbling fountain, and a bench half hidden under a weeping tree. But it was ours. It was where we spent summers, back when everything was brighter. I sat on the bench and closed my eyes, letting the memory of her wash over me. When it was time to leave, I opened the app and booked another ride. To my surprise, Ayaz was the one to accept again. He arrived quickly, as if he'd been waiting nearby, and for the 4-hour drive back, we returned to our familiar silence. That night, when I checked my phone, I saw that he'd given me a discount on the fare. I didn't understand why. Maybe he felt sorry for me. The next day, I booked again. The same route, the same town, the same driver. This time, Ayaz didn't try to talk. He must have sensed that I wasn't ready to share, that my reasons for going weren't casual or fleeting. He simply drove, the steady hum of the engine filling the quiet. And so it began my routine. Every day I would go to the garden. I would sit on the bench, my fingers brushing against the worn wood, and I would remember. The way she laughed, her voice like music. The way her hand felt in mine, warm and steady. The way she looked that last day, her hair catching the light as we walked along the garden path. I didn't want to forget, and the routine helped me hold on. After a few weeks, Ayaz started to speak again, but only when he dropped me off. He would recommend places in the town. A cafe, he said, had the best tea. A market that sold handmade trinkets. I nodded politely but never went. The garden was all I needed. One day, as we neared the town, Ayaz glanced at me in the rearview mirror and asked, "Why do you go every day?" I hesitated. Then, before I could stop myself, I said, "The garden. It's where I remember her." He didn't ask who she was. Instead, he nodded, as if he understood, and let the conversation drop. But something shifted after that. He started waiting for me while I visited the garden, leaving the app open so I could request the ride back whenever I was ready. It was a kindness I hadn't expected, and it made the routine feel less like a lonely ritual and more like something shared, even if only a little. Months passed, and the anniversary of her death approached. That day I dressed in my best clothes, a dark coat she had always liked, polished shoes, and a silver watch she had given me. When Ayaz picked me up, he raised an eyebrow but didn't comment. The ride was quiet, peaceful. When we arrived, I walked to the garden with a bouquet of lilies, her favorite. I laid them on the bench and sat for hours, talking to her as if she were there. It felt different that day, more vivid. As if the distance between us had thinned, just for a moment. When I returned to the car, Ayaz asked softly, "How was it?" It was. Like before, I said. He smiled, and I thought I saw relief in his eyes. But something happened that weekend that shattered the fragile peace I'd built. A news alert on my phone caught my attention: a missing person, a woman, last seen near the garden. Her description was eerily familiar: dark hair, slim build, wearing a light dress. My heart clenched. It was too much of a coincidence. I thought back to that day. The lilies, the quiet, the way it had felt like she was closer than ever. Had I imagined it, or had I in some unknowable way crossed a line I didn't understand? The thought terrified me. I didn't tell Ayaz. I couldn't. When he picked me up the next day, I pretended everything was normal. But the routine felt different now, heavier. The garden no longer brought comfort. Instead, it filled me with questions I couldn't answer. Ayaz must have sensed the change. One day, as we neared the town, he said, "Sometimes holding on too tight can hurt more than letting go." I didn't reply. What could I say? That I was afraid of forgetting her? That the garden was all I had left? That the thought of letting go felt like losing her all over again? But his words stayed with me, and as the days passed, I started to wonder if he was right. Maybe it was time to let go. Maybe it was time to stop being a passenger in my own life. The next morning, I opened the app but didn't book the ride. Instead, I sat in my car and stared at the steering wheel, my hands trembling. Finally, I turned the key and drove. The garden would always be there. But it was time to find my way back to the living. It was time to drive again. There's this hallway in my aunt's house that I can't walk down. Even as I sit here now, the thought of it makes my skin crawl. It's not haunted, not in the Hollywood sense. There's no blood dripping from the walls, no ghostly wails echoing at night. It's just a hallway. Plain. Narrow. Wood-paneled. But for me, it's the place where everything that doesn't make sense in the world seems to gather. I guess it started when I was 8. My mom had just dropped me off at Aunt Soraya's place for the weekend. My parents had some conference out of town, something important enough that they needed me out of the house, but not so important that they'd explain what it was. Soraya lived in this old farmhouse she'd bought for cheap, probably because no one else wanted it. She loved the quirks of it, the sagging floors, the squeaky staircase, the way the front porch tilted slightly to the left. I didn't love it. It felt like the kind of house that shouldn't have people living in it anymore. "Don't mind the house, kiddo," Aunt Soraya had said, tousling my hair as I stood clutching my backpack. "It's got its personality, just like me." She was right about that. Soraya wasn't exactly warm and fuzzy. She was brash, funny, and a little weird, always saying things that left you wondering whether she was joking or not. Like when she told me about the hallway. "Whatever you do, don't go down there after dark," she'd said, nodding toward the far end of the house. Her tone was so casual, so offhand I'd laughed. Why not? Because it's bad luck, she'd replied. Everyone knows that. That was the end of the conversation. She didn't elaborate, and I didn't press her. But as the sun set that night, the hallway drew my eyes like a magnet. It stretched from the living room to a door at the very end, a door that was always locked. The light above it flickered faintly, the bulb weak and yellow, as if it didn't really want to be there either. I told myself it was just a hallway, just a door, just bad wiring in an old house. But when I brushed my teeth that night and crept past it on my way to bed, I swear the air in that hallway felt colder, heavier, like it was trying to press me back. I didn't look directly at the door. I didn't want to know if it was looking back at me. The next day, Soraya was busy. She always seemed busy, even though I couldn't tell you what she was actually doing. I spent most of the morning on the porch reading a comic book one brought. But as noon slipped into afternoon and the shadows started to stretch, I found myself standing at the edge of the hallway again. I don't know why I did it. Maybe it was boredom. Maybe it was the way the air around it seemed to hum, like a faint vibration just out of reach. Whatever the reason, I took one step, then another, my socked feet silent on the wood. The door loomed closer. The flickering light made the peeling paint on it look alive, like something breathing just beneath the surface. When I reached it, I raised my hand without thinking, my knuckles brushing the rough wood. And then I heard it. A faint, rhythmic tapping from the other side. My hand froze midair. The sound wasn't loud, just a soft, deliberate knock, 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 like someone or something wanted me to know it was there. I stumbled back, heart pounding, and turned to run straight into Soraya. Her hands landed on my shoulders, steadying me. "You didn't open it, did you?" she asked sharply, her usual playful tone gone. "No, I didn't." "Good." She relaxed slightly, but her grip stayed firm. "Don't. Ever." I wanted to ask what was behind it, but the words stuck in my throat. She didn't seem like she wanted to explain, and honestly, I wasn't sure I wanted to hear the answer. That night I lay awake in the guest room, staring at the ceiling as the house creaked around me. Every so often I thought I heard that tapping again, faint but insistent, like it was echoing in my own head. Years passed, and I didn't go back to the farmhouse much. My parents stopped needing to leave me there, and Soraya didn't seem to mind. She moved out when I was in high school, selling the place to some developer who wanted to turn it into an Airbnb. I didn't think about it often except on nights when I couldn't sleep, when the memory of that door and its quiet, deliberate knocking crept into my thoughts. It wasn't until last year that I went back. I'm 25 now, and Soraya called me out of the blue, saying she'd found something she wanted me to see. "It's about the house," she said cryptically, refusing to explain further. Curiosity and, I admit, a little guilt for not visiting her more often got the better of me. We met at a diner near her apartment. She slid an envelope across the table. Inside were photos, old, black and white ones of the farmhouse. In one I could see the hallway, the door at the end wide open. But it wasn't the door itself that caught my attention. It was what lay beyond its stairs, descending into what looked like a cavernous space, almost too dark to make out. "What's this?" I asked, my voice uneasy. "That," she said, "is what they sealed up. The developer opened it when they were renovating. Didn't find much, just some empty rooms and a whole lot of bones." "Bones?" My stomach turned. "Animal bones, mostly," she said, though her tone didn't sound convinced. "But the thing is, those rooms? They go deep. Too deep for a house like that." She paused, then added, "And the knocking. It hasn't stopped." I stared at her, the photos trembling in my hands. The diner suddenly felt too bright, too loud. I wanted to ask what she thought it all meant, but I knew she wouldn't give me an answer. Soraya never explained things. She just let you sit with them. Let them burrow into your mind and make themselves at home. That night, for the first time in years, I dreamed about the hallway. I saw the door again, its peeling paint alive with shadows. And behind it, in the darkness, something waited. Fifth story. There's got to be something wrong with me. I'm 22 years old, and I'm still afraid of the dark. Not just uneasy, I mean genuinely afraid. It feels ridiculous, almost childish, but no matter how hard I try, I can't shake the fear. Every night, turning off the lights feels like an impossible task. Last night was no different. One moment I was working on a paper from my art history class about Paleolithic cave paintings, completely absorbed in the details of ancient artwork. The next, my mind conjured an unsettling image of something lurking in the hallway outside my bedroom. It wasn't rational, but it didn't matter. My brain had decided that something sinister was out there. Suddenly, my bedroom felt more like a cage than a safe space, with that dark hallway turning into an invisible barrier. I tried to push the fear aside and focus on my work. But fear has a way of growing when you ignore it. Soon I was glancing at the door every other minute, my heart racing, half expecting it to swing open on its own. To calm myself, I got up and double-checked the lock. It was secure, of course, but the act of checking only made me more aware of the quiet, oppressive atmosphere pressing in around me. It's just my imagination, I told myself, trying to inject some logic into the situation. I even said it out loud, hoping it would break the spell. It didn't. The hallway outside my room felt like it was alive, like something in the shadows knew I was scared. I knew that logically all I had to do was open the door, look into the hallway, and prove to myself that nothing was there. But the thought of actually opening that door made my skin crawl. My anxiety spiked just imagining it, as though opening the door would invite something terrible inside. This isn't the first time I've felt this way. My fear of the dark goes way back, all the way to when I was a kid living in my parents' old house on Eerie Street. I remember the day my dad showed me and my brother the basement. The house was over 100 years old, and the basement hadn't been updated in decades. It was dark, damp, and downright creepy, with stone walls and patches where bricks had been added to stop water from leaking through. Cobwebs hung from every corner, and dead insects littered the floor. But the worst part was the door. At the far end of the basement there was this heavy, rusted door labeled milker room. My dad couldn't get it open, not even with a crowbar. The hinges were caked with rust, and the door seemed fused to its frame. He didn't think much of it, but to my 6-year-old mind, that door became the center of every nightmare I had. At first, I avoided the basement entirely, but at night, when I was supposed to be asleep, my imagination would run wild. I'd lie awake, clutching my blankets, convinced that something was down there behind that door, waiting. Sometimes I thought I could hear faint, muffled voices coming from the basement. It was probably just the old house settling, or the way sound carried through the vents, but I was too young to understand that. To me, it sounded like someone or something trying to get out. My older brother didn't help. He thought it was hilarious to tell me that a monster lived behind the door, a creature with a woman's face and a fur-covered body, desperate to escape. For weeks, I couldn't sleep without calling out for my parents to check on me. When I was 9, we moved to a new house. By then, I was old enough to help my dad pack up the basement. The place didn't scare me as much as it used to, at least not during the day. But one afternoon, while I was alone down there, I heard a noise. It started as a soft tapping, coming from the direction of the milker room door. I froze, my pulse hammering in my ears. The tapping grew louder, more insistent, until it was replaced by a sudden, deafening bang. I bolted up the stairs, nearly knocking into my dad on the way. I told him what I'd heard, my words tumbling out in a panic. He laughed, actually laughed, and took me back downstairs. He opened the door, flicked on the lights, and showed me the source of the noise, a water softener. He'd had it installed a few years earlier to deal with the house's rusty water, and the milker room had been the best place for it. There was nothing sinister behind the door, just an old machine doing its job. I should have felt relief, and I did for a while. But the memory of that fear, the absolute certainty that something terrible was just a few feet away, has stayed with me ever since. And now, here I am, years later, staring at my bedroom door with the same irrational fear clawing at my chest. I keep telling myself it's all in my head. There's nothing waiting for me in the hallway, just like there was nothing behind that basement door all those years ago. But knowing doesn't help. The fear is still there, creeping in, feeding on every dark corner and shadowy thought. Maybe tonight, I'll be brave enough to open the door. Maybe I'll step into the hallway, face the darkness, and prove to myself once and for all that there's nothing to be afraid of. But for now, I'll sit here a little longer, waiting for my courage to catch up with me.